somewhere in the bayous of Louisiana, in a parish whose exact location seems to have been blurred on purpose. There is a documented account so strange it sounds invented. Court papers from 1847 refer to an incident involving 8 hunting dogs, a locked cellar, and a young enslaved woman who emerged after 72 hours, not torn apart, not broken, but transformed into something a local magistrate described only as possessing an authority I cannot explain and dare not question. Within a week, the plantation where it happened was ash. The house burned, the kennel burned, most of the estate records vanished, and yet the story did not. 3 separate letters from neighboring landowners, now scattered through a private collection in Baton Rouge, describe the same impossible sight at dawn: a girl no older than 19, walking calmly through the front gates of the plantation, barefoot, filthy, gaunt from starvation, with 8 massive hunting dogs moving behind her in perfect formation, not snapping, not lunging, not running wild, following. One witness wrote that the dogs looked at her with the devotion of disciples. The woman who owned both the girl and the dogs was dead that same morning in her chambers. Official cause: heart failure. Unofficially, almost nobody who saw the aftermath believed that. What happened in that cellar was never properly investigated, never publicly discussed, and judging by the missing records, very likely buried on purpose. But fragments survived: private journals, parish entries, letters no one expected future historians to compare, oral accounts passed through the descendants of the enslaved community long after the plantation itself disappeared. Tonight, on History Digger, we are pulling those fragments together. And before we continue, if this opening alone has you leaning in, subscribe right now. This channel exists for exactly these stories, the ones history tried to smooth over, erase, or leave trapped in the dark. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, because I want to know how far this community of people who refuse sanitized history has spread. Now let's go to Louisiana. Not the postcard Louisiana. Not jazz and gas lamps and ghost tours. The other Louisiana. Sugar country. Swamp heat. Catholic statues watching over brutal wealth. St. Landry Parish in the 1840s. Sat in that uneasy zone where old French colonial pride was colliding with rising American ambition. It was a world shaped by sugarcane and violence, where fortunes were made not through elegance, but through arithmetic. Land, labor, punishment, yield, everything became a calculation. The air was thick with humidity, so constant, it felt like another layer of clothing. In summer, shirts stuck to skin by sunrise. In winter, damp still found its way into bones. Cypress swamps bordered rows of cane, so long they looked endless, and between them ran shell roads that became rivers of mud when the rains came. The parish seat, Opelousas, was modest: a courthouse, a few stores, homes clustered around a square. On Saturdays, white planters and their families moved through it, as if the whole place existed to reflect their order back at them. Enslaved men and women passed through too, on errands, under watch, carrying goods and messages and burdens that were never theirs by choice. Priests passed through, traders, overseers, drifters, occasionally preachers warning of judgment. But everyone knew the real power was not in town. It was on the estates, each one a kingdom with fences instead of borders, each one ruled by whoever held the deed and the whip. The Devereaux estate lay several miles northwest of Opelousas, down a shell road that could become impassable after a heavy storm. It had originally belonged to the Fontenot family, old Creole money, the kind built over generations through marriages, land accumulation, and a relentless capacity for treating human lives as inventory. But by the early 1840s, the direct line had failed. Deaths, debts, legal transfers, missing heirs, and one suspiciously convenient transaction later, the estate passed into the hands of a woman almost nobody in St. Landry had met in person. Baroness Eloise Devereaux arrived in April 1844 from Charleston, and she arrived like someone who expected the landscape to adjust to her. She brought servants, furniture, imported fabrics, trunks of silver, a reputation. She was said to be the widow of a minor Belgian nobleman, though some people whispered there had been another husband before that, and others whispered the Belgian had died under circumstances from which the Baroness had emerged financially improved. Those details never became public scandal, because in places like St. Landry, money and confidence were often enough to overpower suspicion. She was perhaps 40, beautiful in the way that beauty begins to sharpen once it has to defend itself from time. She dressed in expensive colors that made sure every room noticed when she entered. But what people remembered were not her clothes, it was her face when she was listening. Her eyes had a measuring quality, as if every person, every object, every acre, every conversation was being silently assigned value. She spoke French with a cultivated European edge, English with precision, local Creole, not at all, and made no effort to hide her contempt for it. Within weeks of arriving, she cut deep into the estate staff, dismissed workers, replaced the overseer with a man named Gaspard Thibodeau, who had already been fired from multiple properties for excess cruelty, and imposed a regime that even neighboring planters found unusually severe. That detail matters, because in slave Louisiana, too cruel was a very high threshold. The Baroness also brought with her 8 hunting dogs, and they were not ordinary hounds. They were enormous animals, bred from Mastiff and Bloodhound lines, each nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, each trained not merely to hunt but to intimidate. The Baroness reportedly described them as instruments of control. She had acquired them in South Carolina, from a trainer who specialized in dogs bred to respond to dominance, fear and aggression. She kept them in a specially built kennel behind the main house, and maintained them on a feeding schedule designed to keep them hungry enough to stay dangerous. She named them after royal houses: Bourbon, Savoy, Habsburg, Romanov, Windsor, Grimaldi, Medici, Hohenzollern. She thought this was amusing. Aristocratic bloodlines reduced to obedience. The dogs answered only to her commands, which she gave in clipped German. To everyone else, including Thibodeau, they showed teeth more often than trust. Then in the autumn of 1844, she purchased a girl in New Orleans. The sale appears in a surviving ledger. The girl's age was estimated at 16. The broker's margin note described her as uncommonly defiant. A reduced price was listed due to temperament. Previous owner, somewhere in Virginia, had apparently given up on her after incidents of disobedience. The Baroness paid $400 and had the girl transported to St. Landry in chains. On the plantation, she was renamed Marguerite, almost certainly not the name she had been born with. But plantation systems devoured names and replaced them with something easier to command. Marguerite was slender, underfed, and young enough to still carry traces of childhood in her face. Her hands showed field labor, but also finer training. The notes suggest she had once been intended for house service. Something had happened in Virginia to interrupt that path. No official document says what. But when the Baroness first saw her, she saw immediately what earlier owners had likely seen too. The girl's eyes. They did not lower properly, not fully, not in the total, practiced way expected. They watched, they calculated, they held something that looked too much like self-possession. And for a woman like the Baroness, there was almost nothing more offensive than a person she considered property, who still looked like she possessed an interior life. At first Marguerite was placed in the main house, cleaning, serving, carrying water, laying fires, quiet work under constant scrutiny. The Baroness watched her with the interest of someone examining a puzzle she intended to break open. She found reasons to punish her quickly: a delay in answering, a curtsy not performed fast enough, a look interpreted as insolence. The first major punishment came that November, when Marguerite failed to drop her eyes quickly enough after receiving an order. 20 lashes in the yard, Thibodeau administering, the other enslaved workers forced to watch. Marguerite did not scream. That infuriated the Baroness, far more than tears would have. Silence was not obedience. Silence could be resistance. Over the following months, a pattern settled in. The Baroness assigned impossible tasks, then punished failure. She planted items in Marguerite's quarters and accused her of theft. She altered instructions and raged when the girl did the wrong version of what she had been told. It was not discipline, it was obsession, given a daily routine. The rest of the enslaved community on the estate learned to stay away from Marguerite when they could, not because they disliked her, because attention from the Baroness spread like spilled oil. Anyone too near the fixation risked being dragged into it. Thibodeau began making jokes about how long the girl would last, whether her body would break before whatever was in her spirit did. But the spirit did not break, it bent, it endured, it absorbed punishment, and remained, and the Baroness saw that, every day. By the spring of 1845, another strange detail appears in Thibodeau's later journal. The Baroness spent increasing amounts of time in the kennels, not simply inspecting the animals, training them, tightening command structures, refining responses, reducing food portions, keeping them in a state of controlled agitation. Around that same period, she ordered a cellar built beneath the kennel floor, small, windowless, accessible only through a trap door, 8 feet square, packed earth floor, cypress walls, no stated purpose. Nobody on the plantation asked aloud what it was for. They did not need to. Time passed. Nearly 2 years. Punishments. Labor. Humiliation. Routine. The kind of violence that becomes ordinary because there is no safe place from which to call it extraordinary. Then came the silver bracelet. May 17th, 1847. Humid dawn. Gray sky. Air already heavy. Marguerite rose before sunrise, as always, and moved into her tasks. Empty chamber pots, lay fires, carry water, prepare breakfast service. The house was quiet. The Baroness rarely came downstairs before 9, and those early morning hours were the closest thing the household had to peace. Around 8, while polishing silver in the dining room, Marguerite heard the Baroness's bedroom door open upstairs. Too early, then fast footsteps. Then the Baroness appeared in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, hair partly unpinned, face twisted into that special stillness, before fury. "Where is it?" Marguerite stood. "Ma'am, my bracelet. Gold, sapphires. It was on my nightstand last night. This morning it is gone." The Baroness crossed the room slowly. "You were in my room yesterday." "Yes, ma'am, and now it is missing." "I didn't take anything." That answer earned her a search. Pockets first. Empty. Then quarters. Also empty. The bracelet was nowhere. For a moment, the Baroness just stood there, breathing through her nose, hands flexing open and shut. Then she called for Thibodeau. He arrived almost immediately, riding crop in hand. The Baroness ordered 20 lashes. Marguerite started to say she was innocent. The Baroness struck her across the mouth hard enough to split her lip. Then, in the same breath, she changed her mind. No lashes. No public whipping. She wanted something else, something better, something memorable. Take her to the cellar. Thibodeau actually hesitated. The one under the kennels? Yes. For how long? The Baroness smiled. Until I decide she has learned respect. No food. Water twice daily. Let her listen to the dogs overhead, and think about what happens to thieves. They marched Marguerite across the grounds, past the main house, past the yards, to the kennel building. The dogs began barking the moment the door opened, hurling themselves against the bars of their runs. The noise inside was thunderous. At the far end of the building was the trap door, secured with an iron lock. Thibodeau opened it. A wooden ladder disappeared into darkness. The smell that came up was earth and damp wood and old confinement. Marguerite climbed down. The trap slammed shut above her. The lock clicked, and she was alone beneath 8 massive dogs. At first the cellar was just another punishment, another version of being put away. Marguerite had experienced confinement before, worse in some ways, smaller, hotter, more airless. She knew how to ration thought, how to flatten time, how to survive by reducing life to the next breath, the next hour, The next moment, the space was exactly as described in later testimony. Rough boards, packed dirt, one bucket in the corner, no blanket, no cot, no light but what filtered through the cracks in the floorboards above. Through those cracks came dust, smell, and the constant presence of the dogs. Their pacing, their breathing, their claws scraping wood, their occasional sudden bark. Thibodeau lowered water twice that first day. Nothing else. By the second day, hunger began to sharpen. By the third, it became the main fact of existence. And on the third day, according to every version of the account, water did not come. Instead, that night, lighter steps crossed the kennel floor overhead. The Baroness, Marguerite, heard her voice through the boards. Sweet, almost playful. Are you thirsty, Marguerite? Silence below. I found my bracelet this morning. It had fallen behind my dresser. A pause. So you were innocent. Another pause. But this was never about the bracelet. Now the truth. The Baroness began explaining herself almost lovingly, as certain sadists do when they believe they are about to complete a work of art. What offended her was not theft. It was the look in the girl's eyes, the part of her that had remained intact, the thing she had spent years trying to extinguish. And tomorrow morning, she said, she would finish it. The dogs above had not been fed in 3 days. By dawn she would open the trap. She would send them down. 8 starving animals. 1 weak girl. Nature, she said, would take its course. Unless Marguerite wanted to save herself. Unless she wanted to scream, beg, break, surrender, and finally offer the complete submission the Baroness had always required. She had until dawn. Then the footsteps left. The dogs shifted in the darkness above. Marguerite sat with dry mouth, empty stomach, split lip, and one terrifying certainty. By morning the punishment would become execution, unless she found another script. And this is the point where most people imagine only fear. But survival, real survival, often begins in observation. Marguerite had watched the Baroness with those dogs for 2 years. She had seen how they moved, how they watched one another, how they responded not to kindness, because none was ever shown to them, but to hierarchy, to control, to certainty. They had been shaped by fear and hunger, yes, but also by structure. They were not pets. They were not random beasts. They were creatures trained into a system, and systems can be interrupted. That night in the dark, Marguerite made a decision so extreme it sounds impossible even now. She would not behave like prey. No screaming, no backing away, no running in circles looking for escape. If she could not be stronger than them, she would try to become something else in their eyes. Not prey, not master. Pack. She dug into the earth floor with her hands, partly to give herself something to do, partly because she had noticed signs of rodents during the earlier days. She tore strips from her dress and wrapped her hands and forearms. She chose a position in the center of the cellar where she could turn freely in any direction. She controlled her breathing. Above, dawn approached. Then the lock opened, the trapdoor rose, and the first dog came down. Bourbon, largest of the 8, heavy-muscled, mottled dark coat, jaw broad enough to kill quickly. He descended the ladder with surprising control, hit the packed earth, and immediately fixed on Marguerite. Then came Savoy, then Habsburg, then Romanov, one after another, until all 8 were in the cellar, and the trap remained open above, sunlight behind the Baroness's silhouette. What the witnesses expected was immediate violence. What they got was stillness. Marguerite stood in the center of the cellar, weak, filthy, wrapped forearms hanging at her sides, eyes on Bourbon. Not hard eye contact, not a challenge. Observation, presence. The dogs began to spread out, establishing shape, reading the space, reading one another. The air in the cellar was thick with animal breath, and old waste and fear, so concentrated it should have snapped into blood. Marguerite stepped forward, not away, toward Bourbon. Everything stopped. Predators know what prey usually does. This was not it. She took another step, then lowered herself to one knee, not crouching in submission, lowering to his level. She extended one hand slowly. Bourbon tilted his head. The other dogs froze, waiting. And then Marguerite spoke, not loudly, barely above a whisper. Her throat was dry, her voice rough. "You're hungry. I'm hungry. We're all hungry." She did this. Did the dogs understand the words? No. But words are not only information, they are tone, rhythm, breath, intention. Every creature in that cellar understood intention. The Baroness laughed from above. She believed fear had cracked the girl's mind. But Marguerite kept going. She shifted toward the corner where she had been digging, reached into the shallow depression she had made in the earth, and pulled out what she had saved through the night. A dead rat. Small, pathetic, nowhere near enough to satisfy one dog, much less 8, but enough to redirect instinct. Every dog's attention locked on it. Marguerite tore the rat in half and threw one piece across the cellar. 4 dogs lunged. Bourbon won. The second half went the other direction. Another fight, another instant reward. Then all 8 dogs turned back to her. And something had changed. She was no longer just a body in the space. She was now associated with food, with intervention, with disrupted expectation. She sat down carefully against the wall. The dogs approached, sniffing, testing, breath hot against her arms and face. She did not flinch. That matters more than almost anything. Animals bred for dominance and fear know the language of recoil. They know panic. Marguerite gave them neither. She allowed the investigation, allowed scent to replace fantasy, allowed them to decide for themselves whether she was meat or something stranger. Then Bourbon pressed his massive head against her chest, and she raised a hand and scratched behind his ear. Witnesses above later insisted that his tail moved. One uncertain wag. From there the impossible began. The dogs did not attack. They settled. Not all at once, not sentimentally, but gradually, by inches and breaths and little recalculations. The pack dynamic started rewriting itself. The starving girl in the cellar was no longer prey. She was inside the social structure now. One of them, maybe more than one of them, because she had shown no fear, because she had shared food, because she was trapped as they were trapped. The Baroness shouted commands from above, German words meant to trigger years of conditioning. The dogs ignored her. At midday she threw meat down, expecting frenzy, expecting the old hierarchy to return through appetite. The dogs ate in order, and Bourbon, according to multiple later accounts, carried a piece and dropped it at Marguerite's feet. That was the moment the Baroness stopped sounding amused. By afternoon, the dogs were moving around Marguerite in a ring. Protective, positional. If she shifted, they shifted. If she sat, they lay around her. If she approached the ladder, they formed behind and beside her. The punishment had inverted. The tools of terror had changed allegiance. And that is when the Baroness made the decision that would destroy her. She ordered Thibodeau to go down and retrieve the girl. He refused, not out of mercy, out of practicality. Anyone who descended would die. The Baroness then ordered the dogs brought up without Marguerite. Impossible, Thibodeau said. They would not leave her. The Baroness stared into the cellar, at a scene she could not absorb, a slave she had tried to break. 8 dogs she believed she controlled absolutely, and all of it had shifted outside her command. So she chose a new strategy. Seal them in again. No food, no water. Wait until starvation broke the bond. Wait until nature returned. The trap closed. Darkness again. Now all 9 prisoners remained below. This next part is crucial, because it is where the story stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding unbearable. Marguerite had not escaped. She had only changed the terms of the trap. There was still no easy outcome. The Baroness meant to starve them all until whatever had formed between the girl and the dogs collapsed under biological necessity. 3 more days passed. No screams, no sounds of attack, no feeding frenzy, only occasional movement, and the muffled sounds of life holding on. The household started whispering, because by now everyone on the estate knew something impossible was unfolding under the kennel floor. The Baroness did not sleep much. According to later testimony, she spent those nights pacing, asking for updates, listening through boards, trying to force reality back into a shape she could understand. Then came the fourth morning, and with it the final mistake. The Baroness decided to open the trap herself and end it by force. She gathered the male house staff and armed them with long poles used to control dangerous animals. 5 men, Thibodeau included. The air was heavy with approaching rain, the kind of weather where everything feels electrically wrong before the first drop falls. The trap was unlocked, the door lifted, light poured down, and everyone standing there saw the same thing. Marguerite seated upright, despite obvious weakness, the 8 dogs arranged around her in a perfect circle, all of them looking up together. The Baroness tried command first. "Come up, your punishment is over." No answer. She tried sweetness. "We can forget this happened." Nothing. She tried threat. Still nothing. Then Marguerite finally spoke. No. One word. Dry. Cracked. Absolute. The Baroness demanded she repeat herself. "No. I'm not coming up alone. We're coming up together. Or we stay down here together." This was not just refusal. It was public reversal. The Baroness ordered the men down. They looked into the cellar, and Bourbon stood. The other dogs stood with him, bodies aligning into a formation, every witness later described almost identically. Not chaotic, not panicked, defensive, deliberate. The first man put a foot on the ladder, looked at Bourbon's face, and backed away immediately. He would not go. No one would. The Baroness raged, threatened, ordered them again. Still no one moved. Thibodeau, who had spent his life in violence, quietly told her what she did not want to hear. Defeat had already happened. The only question now was whether they would admit it before someone died. Then Marguerite spoke again, and according to the later letters, her voice sounded stronger than it had any right to. "I'm coming up. The dogs are coming with me. You can close that door and let us all die. Or you can step back." The Baroness lifted her pistol and pointed it into the cellar. That moment appears in every account. The girl below, the dogs coiled around her, the Baroness above with the gun. And then Marguerite said something that may be the coldest line in the whole story. "You could shoot me, but then you'd have 8 starving dogs with no reason left to restrain themselves, and only one way out." Whether that was bluff or certainty does not matter. It worked. For one stretched second nobody moved. Then Thibodeau lowered the Baroness's arm. He did what no one on that estate should have dared do. He touched her and overrode her, not openly in rebellion, not yet, but enough. He told Marguerite to come up, and she did, slowly, weakly, climbing that ladder after days of starvation and confinement. One by one, the dogs climbed behind her with a coordination witnesses would never forget. Bourbon first, then Windsor, then the others in sequence. No chaos, no snapping, no confusion. When Marguerite stepped into the morning light, she looked half dead, and somehow more alive than anyone else in that building. The dogs emerged and instantly arranged around her, the men backed against the walls, and the Baroness looked at what she had made and failed to own. "What are you?" she whispered. Marguerite answered, "Exactly what you tried to destroy." What followed was less an argument than an exposure. Marguerite told her what no one else on the plantation had ever said aloud to her face, that she had bought her because she seemed breakable, that every punishment had failed, that the dogs now understood something their owner never had. Cruelty is not strength. Fear is not loyalty. The Baroness had made them all tools, starved them, owned them, used them, and in the cellar dog and girl had recognized each other, not as enemies, but as fellow prisoners. The Baroness insisted she still held the law, still held ownership, still held power. Marguerite answered with the one thing tyranny can almost never survive: demonstration. Everyone in the room had now seen the failure, not rumored it, seen it. A slave refusing, the dogs obeying her, the overseer hesitating, the men refusing orders, the pistol lowered. Absolute authority had cracked. The Baroness turned to Thibodeau and ordered him to seize Marguerite. He did not move. Nobody did. Then Marguerite began walking toward the door. The dogs moved with her. The men parted, and at the threshold she turned back and said she was leaving the plantation. With the dogs, the Baroness could try to stop her if she wanted. Shoot her in the back in front of witnesses, or let her go. Either way, everyone would know what had happened. That line broke something. The Baroness fired. One shot. It missed wide. Whether by panic or intention, nobody ever knew. The blast echoed across the plantation and brought workers running from fields and buildings. They arrived in time to see Marguerite walking steadily up the road away from the estate, 8 dogs around her in moving formation, the Baroness in the kennel doorway with smoke curling from the pistol barrel, and Thibodeau restraining her arm. That image lodged in every mind that saw it, and now it was no longer containable. The Baroness said she would send for parish authorities, report a runaway, offer a reward, have Marguerite brought back in chains. But even as she said it, witnesses later claimed she sounded less certain than she ever had before. Marguerite disappeared around the bend in the road, the dogs with her, and the Baroness turned back toward the house, rigid, silent, controlled in the way people are controlled when they are holding themselves together by habit alone. What happened in her chambers over the next several hours was reconstructed later through servant testimony. She locked the door, refused food, refused company. Sometime around late afternoon, smoke began slipping under the frame. When the door was forced open, she was found lying on the bed, composed, hands folded, no sign of struggle. The parish doctor called it heart failure, but the room told a different story. A specific herbal tea had been requested. The plants in it were from the Baroness's own garden. Foxglove, monkshood, enough poison to stop a heart with elegance. So the official record says natural causes. The unofficial record says she chose death rather than live one day, in a world where a girl she had tried to annihilate had walked out with the instruments of her own terror, trailing behind her. And then within a week, the plantation burned. Officially an accident, unofficially, almost certainly not. Accounts from later oral histories suggest fires began in multiple places. Too many, too neatly timed. The people who had lived under the Baroness's cruelty watched her world catch and collapse, and for once no one rushed too hard to save it. The house burned, the kennels burned, storage structures burned. What records remained were destroyed or scattered. The Devereux estate never truly recovered, because nothing was left to recover. Now here is where the story should disappear. In a system that controlled records, courts, newspapers, sheriffs, and property law, Marguerite should have been hunted, caught, listed as recovered inventory, and dragged back into documentation. But she wasn't. No matching runaway notice has ever been found in Louisiana newspapers from that period. No bill of sale for the dogs appears. No record of her capture, no transfer, nothing official, just absence. And then the letters. One planter, writing to a relative, described seeing a young black woman traveling north along the river road, with 8 large dogs moving in exact order around her. He claimed he first assumed she had escaped from some nearby property, and nearly rode up to challenge her. Then he met her eyes and stopped. The dogs shifted position between them. Not violently, deliberately. He stepped aside. Another witness wrote that she carried herself with the authority of a commander. Another said no one who saw her wanted to interfere, though all understood they were watching something they had no category for. One letter contains the line that still catches in the throat. She appeared as one who had passed through fire and emerged transformed. Where did she go? Nobody knows. North, maybe. Toward free territory. Possibly. Toward a maroon community. Also possible. Toward people who understood not to ask too many questions. If a young woman arrived with 8 impossible guardians at her back. Maybe. The dogs disappear from the record with her. No recovery. No sale. No mention. Just gone. The land itself was eventually divided, sold, absorbed into neighboring holdings. The kennel site vanished under plowing and time. The cellar was filled in. Its exact location is now unknown. But the story lived. That matters. It lived among the formerly enslaved and their descendants, in The Whispered Girl and the Dog story that appears in fragments later collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. Details shift in oral history, dates move, places blur, but the core remains stubbornly consistent. A girl meant to be broken, a punishment meant to become execution, dogs meant to terrify, and a walk away from bondage no one could stop. Gaspar Thibodeau himself left Louisiana shortly after. He died a few years later in Texas. But before that, he wrote. His journal, discovered among his effects, is one of the strongest surviving threads in the case. He was not a sentimental man, not a secret abolitionist, not a witness inclined toward mystical language. He was a brutal overseer, trying to explain a thing he could not fit into his own understanding of animals, discipline, and power. His final reflections on the incident are almost a confession. He says what the Baroness attempted went beyond even the cruel standards of their world. He says what the girl accomplished exceeded everything he understood about nature. He says he expects to die not understanding it, and perhaps deserves that confusion. That is not the language of a man telling campfire fiction. It is the language of someone haunted. And this is the part where we have to sit with the implications. Because the legal system around the plantation absolutely could have dug deeper. A dead mistress by poison, a burned estate, a missing enslaved woman, 8 missing high-value hunting dogs, multiple witnesses. Instead, the authorities recorded almost nothing and moved on. Why? Because to investigate honestly would have required acknowledging a crack in the entire logic of slavery. An enslaved girl had refused absolute authority and won. Not in court, not with weapons, not through legal manumission, through survival so complete it changed the behavior of creatures bred to enforce terror. That story could not be allowed to stand as public fact, so it was minimized, smoothed, filed down into natural causes, accidental fire, no suspicious circumstances. But the story refused burial, and maybe that is the most important thing about it. Not whether every tiny detail can be verified to modern standards, not whether the exact wording in every witness account can be reconstructed, but that too many fragments point the same direction to ignore. A ledger, a journal, parish entries, private letters, oral tradition, all circling one event. Now let's talk about the dogs, because that is where most people either lose the thread or start reaching for the supernatural. Do I think this was magic? No. Do I think it was simple? Also no. The most unsettling explanation is probably the human one. Marguerite understood something the Baroness never did. Fear can force submission. It cannot create loyalty. The dogs had been ruled through deprivation and threat. Marguerite met them in a state of shared suffering. She did not dominate them. She did not beg them. She entered their world with absolute presence and no performance of prey. In the conditions of that cellar, with their hierarchy destabilized by hunger and confinement, that may have been enough to trigger a total recalculation. Not affection, not domestication, alliance. And alliance between the condemned is one of the most dangerous things any oppressive system can face. Because once tools stop identifying with the hand that uses them and start identifying with one another, the whole structure shifts. The Baroness believed power flowed in one direction, downward, from owner to overseer to dog to slave. What happened in that cellar appears to have reversed the current. Marguerite offered the dogs the one thing the Baroness never had: recognition. Not pity, recognition. You are trapped too. You are hungry too. You are being used too. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe there was something in Marguerite herself, some steadiness, some impossible command under pressure, that transformed observation into allegiance, faster than any modern explanation likes to admit. Either way, by the time that trap door opened on the 4th morning, the dogs had chosen. That is what terrified the witnesses. Not just that the girl lived, that the hierarchy had flipped. And because this is History Digger, I want to leave you not just with the story, but with the question underneath it. What really happened in that cellar? Was it a perfect storm of animal behavior, trauma, and survival instinct? Was it evidence that solidarity can form in places we do not expect, even across species, when cruelty strips everything down to its rawest truth? Or was it something else, something the witnesses themselves lacked language for, which is why they reached for words like authority, transformed, and dare not question? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you made it to the end of this account, you have just spent time inside one of the strangest and darkest stories in American history, one that powerful people tried very hard to erase. Subscribe to History Digger if you want more of these buried accounts. Share this with someone who thinks history is only dates and presidents and wars. Because somewhere in Louisiana, in 1847, a young woman walked out of slavery with 8 starving dogs following behind her, and a whole system decided it would be safer to pretend that never happened. But it did, or something close enough to it did, that the record still trembles where people tried to touch it, and that tremble is exactly where we dig.